Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today I'm covering Penny Foolish and Nautical Novice. I don't like when I have nothing to say in the intro because I feel like that just means the coming episodes are going to be uninteresting. I can tell you now that neither of these episodes are uninteresting, but I don't know what I can say. I'm only at the beginning of season 6, so it's not quite right to be like, these episodes are very season 6. Though, considering I have already reviewed this season, I can actually say that these episodes are very season 6, but theoretically, y'all should not know what I mean by that yet, unless I'm speaking to your personal sense of what season 6 is. Yeah, I have no idea why I've been rambling so much lately. It's a little distracting, but it's getting my thoughts out there, even if in a very unorganized manner, so maybe it's not all bad. But let me just go ahead and move on to the part where I say thank you to everyone watching today, and now let's just get right into it. The third episode of season 6 is Penny Foolish, an episode that follows Mr. Krabs. So there's two interesting things I've noticed so far regarding season 6. Firstly, that's 3 episodes in a row that aren't strictly about SpongeBob. Yes, he appears in all 3, but the last 3 episodes have been Squidward, Plankton, and now Mr. Krabs centric. And as such, with all of the episodes, it takes a few minutes for SpongeBob to even appear. Kinda neat. Maybe this points to some experimenting with what characters episodes will focus on, which can definitely be a really good thing since it can lead to more kinds of plots and more interesting and unique material. The other thing that I have noticed is that in this season we saw Plankton before we saw Mr. Krabs, since this episode is the first time we see the crustacean this season. This doesn't really mean anything unlike the previous tidbit, but I just felt like sharing this note. Alright, let's get into this episode now. So, the beginning scene of Penny Foolish with Mr. Krabs doing some shopping is pretty entertaining, and it's got some funny moments in there as well. I love how completely done the cashier is, because that is a mood right there for anyone who has ever worked a service job, and I've worked multiple. Penny Foolish gets moving quick as Mr. Krabs looks out the window and witnesses SpongeBob doing something weird. I'll be honest, this bit kinda dragged for me, though lately I've decided to view this next minute or so a little differently. So the joke or bit here is that Mr. Krabs sees SpongeBob exhibit this odd behavior, and then he thinks back to what he just saw, and so the scene plays out the exact same. I mean, I still stand by the fact that this drags, but now I think it's funny that the scene just repeats itself. It's kind of an unexpected kind of humor, and it's just kind of slow. It doesn't really quite crumb across like a joke at times, more like filling up time, and I think that's why my opinion on it has kind of flip-flopped. Mr. Krabs assumes that SpongeBob's behavior indicates that he's found a penny on the ground. I think it's kind of funny that Mr. Krabs is so convinced that it's a penny specifically, not any other coin or denomination. And as the episode goes on, I like how Mr. Krabs grows increasingly obsessed with this penny. This reminds me a lot of Squeaky Boots, and it's really entertaining. I really loved the part where Mr. Krabs was driving and then the moon turned into a penny. That was so freaking funny, and I like that it works even as a very anticipatable joke. You see the moon in the background and you know what's coming. Clancy Brown excellently voice acts Mr. Krabs' growing preoccupation during this part and during the rest of the episode more generally. I also just like the way the camera repeatedly zooms out as Mr. Krabs yells, just a nice bit of smooth camera work and voice acting working together. And I like highlighting little moments like that. Mr. Krabs' obsession starts leading him to act just a bit off-putting. I really loved the way Mr. Krabs had this faux cheery with a side of creepy vibe going on at the Krusty Krab, and speaking of this first little bit at the Krusty Krab, I loved Squidward's brief appearance here. Just like the cashier at the supermarket, his utter doneness is a great reaction to the whole situation. Always love when Squidward plays the straight man to Mr. Krabs. It's a great part of their dynamic. Back to Mr. K, I just love how unashamedly obsessed he is with this penny. The way he literally shakes SpongeBob down over it was so funny. This move by him also leads to a pretty entertaining chase scene with SpongeBob's brain, which I think is a good example of the random comedy of this show. Moving on, Mr. Krabs' attempts to get the penny from SpongeBob get more and more absurd and entertaining, and that's one thing that this episode does well, escalation. The theater is a pretty funny idea, especially when you think of how much money it must have taken to make the dang theater. A lot more than a penny, that's for sure, and I think that just goes to show in a pretty humorous way that while perhaps at first this whole crusade was about adding a decimal point to his bank account, now Mr. Krabs doesn't even care about getting this penny for the sake of increasing his money. He just wants the penny to have it, because he he wants and feels entitled to all of the money he sees. He saw that penny, but he didn't get it, and so now he's obsessed with it. This is some pretty great characterizing writing, I'd say. Mr. Krabs' dramatic reaction after SpongeBob once again says he doesn't have a penny is great, and I love how he just demolishes the theater. Oh, and I really liked the gag of Mr. Krabs making dolphin noises. His next attempt, the charity night, is probably my favorite because of how hilariously solemn Mr. Krabs is in recounting his great cause. And I know I already said this, but Clancy Brown really is that dude in this episode. I also think it's funny to think of how Mr. Krabs managed to rope Squidward into his charade as well. Squidward really is another highlight of Penny Foolish for me, and I love how melodramatic SpongeBob is as well, crying about not having a penny to give, and I love the visuals of Mr. Krabs losing his eyes and screaming after once again having his attempts to get this penny foiled. By this point of the episode, Mr. Krabs has completely lost his mind. He surveils SpongeBob's house while muttering nonsensical things, and then he just breaks in. Mr. Krabs losing it is very entertaining to me, so I like this. We then get a Gary appearance, which of course I'm mentioning this, like, y'all know who I am, that's my goat. And this leads to the resolution of the episode, as when SpongeBob catches Mr. Krabs in his house, Mr. Krabs has no choice but to finally confess. I love how Gary gives Mr. Krabs a wary look for the rest of the scene, like that was a nice little touch, and the reveal that the penny was just a simple gum wrapper was fun, and I like how this reveal kind of touches on the very real psychological phenomenon of false memories, although Mr. Krabs did initially mistake the gum wrapper for a penny, color and all, which really goes to show the top-down influence on perception, and oh my god, let me stop talking now. We then, of course, get the real final little stinger that the perceived gum wrapper was actually $500, which SpongeBob has no interest in, and that Mr. Krabs couldn't let go of his obsession, digging holes around SpongeBob's house. Really good contrast between these two characters. Alright, before I do the sum up, there's one last thing I want to talk about. So, I read through the comments on this episode discussion for this episode back on the SpongeBuddy Mania forum, and I have come to realize that my thoughts on this episode are rather unpopular. It seems a lot of people don't like that Mr. Krabs is so obsessed with this penny, and they find this to be an indicator of how greedy and selfish this character has become. I disagree. Frankly, I think some of this might be an indication that people didn't really get this episode. Like, yes, you're right, that it's ridiculous that Mr. Krabs is obsessed with this penny. But that's the point. It's supposed to be ridiculous and absurd. It's meant to be comedic. That's why the episode ends like it does. The comedy is in the extreme lengths that Mr. Krabs goes to, and his inability to let this penny go. It's fair to not find this funny, but I think people have taken this episode too seriously. And as for whether this episode is evidence of Mr. Krabs' character being changed to be greedier or more selfish or, God forbid, flanderized, I disagree. And not just because of the flanderized word, which everyone and their mom knows I hate, but like, this is all entirely in character for Mr. Krabs using the character that has already been established. We can all agree that Mr. Krabs is obsessed with money, correct? In this episode, he acts just as entitled to every last penny as he did in Born Again Krabs and Culture Shock, not to mention the entire part where Mr. Krabs runs after a coin in Imitation Krabs. So no one should be reasonably arguing that Mr. Krabs is out of character. If you dislike this episode, that's fine, but this episode is most certainly not proof of characters being ruined or anything like that. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I can bring everything together. So far, Season 6 is a season of enjoyable episodes because Penny Foolish is yet another really enjoyable episode, the third in the row. It's the best out of the 3 I've reviewed so far. This episode is just super funny. Mr. Krabs' dramatics are usually a foolproof source of humor anyway, so this isn't surprising. And everyone in this episode was really at their A-game. SpongeBob was perfectly oblivious and unwitting, while also playing along nicely with the drama, and Squidward provided some really great snark and deadpan humor. So just all sorts of good here. And lastly, the writing was very good at showing who these characters are, particularly Mr. Krabs. That's why Penny Foolish will be the first episode of Season 6 to reach Amazing, where it's coming in with a score of 9.3 out of 10. Here's a question for everyone watching. Would you consider Nautical Novice to be an infamous episode? An interesting question, isn't it? I think the fact that I think this at all is indicative of the YouTubers I used to watch, but I've always been honest about that aspect of my past in this fandom. I took a look at the comments on this episode discussion for this episode on the forum, and they seem to be a pretty mixed bag. Some people like this episode, and some don't. And just like with any notorious or disliked episode of this era, the comments start off more positive and grow more negative over time. I wonder why. That's sarcasm. Anyway, I don't think this episode is actually infamous. Disliked, maybe. Like, I guess the ending of this episode is more infamous than anything, kind of similar to how the toenail scene is the infamous part of House Fancy, or how the ending of Spongehenge is the most memorable part of that episode. All I know is that in the past, I was not a big fan of this episode at all. Since then, my opinions have changed. But that doesn't mean much without knowing how those opinions have changed. So let's discuss. First, I want to give a fun little production fact that I noticed when doing the written review of this episode. So this episode and its sister episode, Penny Foolish, used the same title card music, Drunken Sailor. Additionally, Penny Foolish ended with Drunken Sailor, making it a fun experience watching the sister episodes back to back. This kind of musical consistency is something that I've been noticing a lot recently, since in the last few weeks and months I kind of did a rewatch of seasons 6 through 9, and this happens kind of frequently. I'm not going to point this out every time, but it happens more often than you'd think. I'll just say that the same thing happens between Not Normal and Gone with the track Cream Pie. The use of Drunken Sailor is just about the only real similarity between Penny Foolish and Nautical Novice. This includes my opinions too, because I like one of these episodes, and one not so much. And y'all have already seen the one I like. One thing that's interesting about Nautical Novice is that, as a boating school episode, this episode leans into the child side of the line for SpongeBob in a way that makes it feel like he's straight up going to school. It does this to the same effect as Procrastination and New Student Starfish, with the class going on a field trip and them learning more about boats and boating than just how to drive them. And I say it feels like SpongeBob is straight up going to school because we certainly don't learn the history of cars or car maintenance in driving school, that's for sure. The main idea of this episode is that SpongeBob decides he's going to learn a shit ton about boating so that he can impress Mrs. Puff and get a license on the spot. This plan is nonsensical at best, and unfortunately not in a good way. So that's one thing about this episode I already don't like. The plot doesn't really fit with what we've already established in this show, and yes, I know this show has no continuity, don't even start, but there are some things that generally don't change. One of those is that if SpongeBob wants a license, he must pass his boating test. That never changes. There could be additional things he needs to do, such as the presentation and oral report, or the paper and procrastination, but if he wants the license, he's gotta do the test. So it's kind of weird that SpongeBob would even think this would work. In a way, the episode does resolve this because of the whole part where SpongeBob drives the big museum boat, and so by the end of the episode, I can slightly forgive this lack of consistency. And also, SpongeBob is the only one to think this would work, so the episode also gets a pass because of that. It's a misconception only one character has, not the actual plot itself. Getting into the actual happenings of the episode now, I love how utterly exhausted Mrs. Puff is by SpongeBob, calling to the heavens to give her strength in these trying times. I also like that we get to see SpongeBob's library again, because it's been a while. Unfortunately, from here we get about a minute or so of dullness as SpongeBob reads the book, and then we cut to the next morning. SpongeBob ends up having to chase after the bus since he spent the whole night reading. At least the bus chase was decently entertaining, though it wasn't long enough in my opinion. From here, we see SpongeBob be quite knowledgeable on all things boating. On one hand, it's kinda cute and satisfying to see him know so much about boating, given his enthusiasm and how hard he's been working to get his license. But on the other hand, his know-it-all attitude gets quite grating at points, especially as the episode goes on, which yes, this is the point, but I still don't like it. Eventually, SpongeBob enters the main control room of the huge museum boat, meaning that we finally get our expected dose of SpongeBob SquarePants chaos. This also means the episode finally stops being dull. SpongeBob accidentally starts the huge boat, and this leads to a very entertaining sequence of the boat going out of control while he and Mrs. Puff freak out about it. But SpongeBob gains his wits and starts showing off that knowledge he got from that tome of a book. And for me, at this point, Nautical Novice just becomes Fast and Furious for boats, complete with ridiculous maneuvers. And now I'm thinking about that Polar Drift Express video. That shit is so funny to me. Okay, but anyway, characters performing some ridiculous maneuver, especially when it's dangerous or has never been attempted before, is a trope I adore, as niche as it is. It's so niche that it doesn't really have a TV tropes page, which is a shame. Like, you know that one part in the movie Interstellar, the no time for caution scene? Yeah, like that shit, I'm all over it. But anyway, I just love the melodrama and ridiculousness of this scene. It makes for very entertaining television. So SpongeBob manages to pull off stopping the boat before it drives straight into Bikini Bottom, and as a reward for his knowledge and prowess, Mrs. Puff decides to bestow upon him his driver's license. At least until they both realize that SpongeBob didn't actually do shit, and a worker was just pulling the museum boat into port. And so Mrs. Puff shreds up SpongeBob's license in his face. Okay, listen. I've had many thoughts and opinions on this ending, and I think I finally landed on one I feel comfortable with. So, Obviously, the episode could not end on SpongeBob having his driver's license. It was necessary to reestablish the status quo. So I'm not faulting this ending for that. It was needed. However, I think the ending was a little bit malicious to SpongeBob. Now, on one hand, it is kind of payback for the smugness SpongeBob was exuding throughout the rest of the episode, but on the other, it still felt a bit mean. Like, I didn't need to see Mrs. Puff rip off SpongeBob's license angrily like he tricked her on purpose. If they had done something a bit different with that specific character action, I would have been fine. And as for the contrived coincidence of the ending here, I'm not mad about that either. It's the kind of random comedy I've come to expect from this show, not to mention it was actually foreshadowed earlier in the episode with SpongeBob mentioning the museum boat is tugged into port, so that was actually neat. And then the very last part of the ending with SpongeBob getting his sea legs and then causing the boat to tip over, because above all else, SpongeBob simply cannot drive, that was actually really funny. So I feel a lot more positively about this ending than I used to, now that I've given it more thought. That's one of the reasons why my opinions on Nautical Novice used to be a lot worse. I thought the ending was bad. But now I'm realizing that the ending was actually good, and everything else is bad. Like, this episode doesn't get interesting until like 7 minutes in, when the boat starts moving. Before that, this episode is quite dull and hardly worth watching, so generally mediocre tier material. But the last 4 minutes do a lot to pull this episode out of that tier up to okay tier, where it's being placed with a score of 6.3 out of 10. As always, I'll be ending this video with some closing thoughts of mine. This is something I actually did not mention until my written review of Gone, but I thought I'd mention it here instead, and that's that it's interesting how both of these episodes have endings that people don't really like. Now, the ending of Penny Foolish is moderately disliked, and the end of Nautical Novice is disliked, but perhaps not infamous, but I think it's interesting that we might be catching on to a trend here. I mean, we all know about the ending of Gone, and how that is quite infamous, but I'll get there next week, so I won't talk about it now. I just think that it's interesting to note this potential trend and see if it becomes a full-on trend or just a coincidence. Because if it does become a trend, what does it mean? I mean, people don't like the endings of Nautical Novice and Gone because they're mean-spirited. The ending of Penny Foolish is an outlier in that regard, since people who don't like that ending are usually talking about how it doesn't make sense, isn't funny, or is proof of flanderization for Mr. Krabs' character. So I wonder if we should be on the lookout for mean-spirited episodes? I don't know, just something to note. But that's really the only closing thought I've got, as unorganized as it is, so I'll just end the video here and I'll see y'all in the next review.